soon. And we are now being recorded. So welcome everyone to the second Zcash protocol hangout devoted to discussions of future development funding and Zcash improvement proposals that address that issue. So I'm going to lay out a few ground rules, few guidelines for the conversation. Instead of going around and having everyone doing introductions, what we're going to try this time is you introduce yourself the first time that you speak, the first time that you pipe up and say something. So hello, I'm Sonia. I work in community outreach at the Zcash Foundation, and I'm your host today. Thank you all for coming. So when you do want to speak, you should queue up in the chat section of Hangouts. You can just ping or say, I want to talk next, whatever. And we're not going to have a hard and fast rule here, but I want to let the more talkative people know, please make an effort to, I don't know, give a little room for people who are quieter or maybe not as eager to jump in. And if you are a particularly talkative person, please don't feel offended if at any point I ask you to step back a little bit or let another couple of people talk before you do. The general principle here is that 2 more people should talk before you speak again. But like I said, it's not a hard and fast rule, more of a guideline. So please keep that in mind. And lastly, I'm going to link in the chat section of this meeting. This is the list that we're going to be working from. This has the list of the currently active Zcash improvement proposals that address development funding. I have yet to figure out a non-clunky way to communicate that, but you'll live. So we're not going to go exactly in order because in the order that the list is in, because I do want to ask the different ZIP champions who are here, do any of you have time constraints, like you'll have to leave at a certain point? I know Josh Cincinnati does. Do any of the other ZIP champions need to participate before a certain time when they have to leave?
I actually need about 10 minutes because I'm in the car. So if I could not participate for 10 minutes, that would be fantastic.
All right. Matt, you are not allowed to speak for 10 minutes. Okay, so it sounds like everyone else is all right, except for, so I guess we might as well start with Josh. And then once Matt is able to speak again, he can chime in, since I suspect that Matt and Josh's proposals are somewhat related to each other. So we're probably going to want to dig into that. Oh, so we just got a question in the chat about the trademark discussion. And Josh, do you want to take this since you're here?
I can, yeah. I can field this. So the ball is firmly in the foundation's court. We have a pretty much final document that just is literally being assembled as we speak, and I expect that it will be, barring no contention on either side at this point, which I think we've gone through all possible contention, it will be signed and good to go. But I'm still waiting on receiving that.
I'm literally setting it up right now in eDoc.
Oh, okay, there you go. And it will be sent over and then signed very, very shortly, actually, I hope. So the news on the trademark is that there is a forward path and people we'll be able to see the full agreement very, very soon.
That was Anthony, the operations director, who said that.
Josh, can we speak at all to what's in the trademark or a trademark agreement, or should we hold off? It's unfortunate timing that we couldn't get this out right before this call, but sorry guys, we didn't know when it was going to happen.
So I think that in general it follows the spirit of what I think was always sort of promised in terms of providing 2 of 2 enforcement and 2 of 2 acclamation about what constitutes Zcash, and it is it's a donation to the foundation with the ECC retaining that sort of second signatory power around enforcement and calling Zcash. So
okay, so
I think
it sounds like for the purposes of this discussion, people can assume that, as with the ZIP process, this foundation and ECC both have a say in what constitutes Zcash in terms of the trademark?
Yeah, I think that's completely fair to say. And if anyone in the ECC wants to chime in and agree or add nuance, feel free. But that is, I think, a really good summary of where it stands.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. This is DC from the ECC, and I think Josh accurately characterized where we're at. So great news on the progress. And I think this does codify in legalese this 2 of 2 multisig that we think is so important. One important addition I want to call out is that in addition to establishing that 2 of 2, it also establishes provisions to help us avoid deadlock should we get into a situation where the foundation and the ECC disagree.
Okay, so thank you for adding that, DC. I'm going to cut it off here because I don't want us to spend too much time focusing on the trademark rather than the zips. So Steve had a couple of quick questions first about the timeline. Expect details on that very soon. That should be published shortly, but it hasn't been yet. So it's still undefined, soon to be defined. And then you had another question, Steve. What was the other one?
Yeah, just from what I heard there, this 2 of 2 sign-off, how does this relate to the ECC giving its 2 of 2 sign-off to the community? Because they said they'd implement whatever we said we wanted. So is it now, I don't understand. Did the ECC still have veto over this funding process or not?
Josh, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think my view is that the ECC and the Zcash Foundation both only intend to implement what the community's desire is for the dev fund. The thing is, we might have differences of opinions in terms of interpreting what the community's will is, and that's what this agreement is meant to help adjudicate, particularly the escalation pieces that DC mentioned earlier. So I don't think it changes their intent at all. It certainly doesn't change our intent there.
Thank you, Josh. Oh,
Josh
sorry.
from
Go
ECC.
ahead.
Yeah, in fact, we've been working on this for like a year. So it's a very novel agreement. I think it's going to be really interesting for the broader community as well in terms of how to handle trademarks. But there's a specific provision in the agreement that, again, we're going to publish the agreement in full. So you'll be able to read the final PDF signed version. But in the agreement, there's a specific provision that mandates that both parties are honoring the will of the community. And then, as Josh Cincinnati alluded to, there's an escalation process if for some reason there's a disconnect or a disagreement on what the community's will is.
All right. Thank you, Josh. So I think we've covered what we need to about the trademark, and we can discuss that further. I think it'll be better once the full agreement is published and everyone can see what it says exactly. So let's wait to go further on that conversation until then. And right now, we're going to start talking about Josh Cincinnati's ZIP, which is titled A Grand Compromise / Synthesis ZIP Proposal. And I'm dropping the link in our chat right now. Josh, do you want to perhaps say a little bit about what you're accomplishing with this proposal and how you feel about it currently, or what direction you think it's going to go?
Yeah. So the goal of this proposal, which is, when it was proposed in late August, was I was trying to consolidate a bunch of what I thought were subjectively, good ideas from a variety of proposals and turn them into one particular, one approach to dev funding. Honestly, like I think the sort of TLDR does a really good job of saying, defining what makes it special, which is it sidesteps code complexity and implementation by simply using a trust instead of putting all that on the code. It funds both the ECC and the Zcash Foundation. The ECC stays a for-profit with restrictions, and then funds external parties through ZF grants with dedicated funding that way. Ties some of the payouts to shielded adoption, which is, I think, a key metric that is unambiguous and worthwhile one to optimize on, and then also provides an opportunity to have a kind of sandbox for expanding governance out to other parties through changing the way that the ZF grants process works, which is where a non-trivial amount of the funding would come from in this proposal. So I, in general, like I was really happy to see Matt Luongo's proposal come up, because there are a lot of ways that I think it kind of improves on this one. It came by a little bit later. There's some ways in which, to be honest, like I think that there are some differences in the approach that he took compared to, and I know he's on this call and we'll be talking about his proposal in a little bit, but there's some things that I think are different in terms of the way that we approach the governance question of funds, and in some sense, I think that much like the other strategic council approaches, this Matt's proposal is still a bit more, a bit risky, but in the right direction for expanding the kind of governance that you can see, governance expansion and getting more stakeholders in. I think what I'd like to do with my proposal as it stands today is take some of the pieces from Matt's proposal that I really like, particularly about the kinds of groups that could govern future funding, and the way that he approached non-ECC and non-ZF groups to contribute to Zcash development, and make that a slightly more codified in the way that the ZF grants platform is the way that that's supposed to work in my proposal. Because right now that's actually the most ambiguous part of my proposal, and I think that kind of incorporating that would be really helpful. But then that there's still enough. Like I was thinking that maybe they could be combined, but I like the idea of trying to see how how much can be incorporated from a lot of these proposals, while giving people an opportunity to voice their opinion on one or the other, and giving people like a fair amount of choice in which proposals they want to see. So anyway, that's where my current feeling is about it, and happy to field questions on its state and other questions about the proposal as it stands, because it hasn't really changed much since then.
All right, Matt, you're up.
Sure. Hello. So yeah, I took
remember to introduce yourself. Sorry, that was just previously was Josh Cincinnati, the executive director of the Zcash Foundation, but his proposal is not an official foundation proposal. Sorry, Matt, you go ahead and introduce yourself now.
Sure. Hey guys, I'm Matt Luongo. I'm an entrepreneur in the space. I've been a Zcash holder and sort of like lightly involved since it kicked off. I have been watching this discussion with great interest, and decided to sort of throw a proposal in the ring, because we as a development team are actually interested in doing quite a bit more work around Zcash, which the details of which I'm trying to save until after we get a little bit further in the zip process. So my kind of perspective is as an outside development team that would like to have a maybe not the same, but kind of similar arrangement as the ECC, where we are servicing the chain and Zcash holders. So my zip is, that perspective is very much there. There are a couple things I think that are worth remark. So one is that unlike the So while it has some similarities to the strategic council approach that Avichal and a couple of others have put forward, I actually believe that the Zcash Foundation is a fine governance structure. I think that there are a couple changes that need to be made at the foundation to allow it to kind of continue to be properly disentangled from the ECC and stand on its own legs. So that includes changes around a little bit around its direction and focus, but mostly around board composition. In my proposal, I include it's a bottom line. It's a 20% dev fee. A quarter of that goes to the foundation. The foundation, the idea is that the foundation, if it's making over $500K a month from that dev fee, that there's actually an easing function, so that if the Zcash price is doing quite well, the foundation doesn't just make gobs and gobs. There's a whole bunch of rationale behind that. If anyone has questions, it also carves out another quarter, another 25% of that 20% for a role that I call the principal developer role. And this is a role that has some governance capacity. And it's really a role that was made for the ECC. Though I did leave room for someone else to take it if this is not in the ECC's best interest to continue working directly with Zcash. But the most important thing that this proposal does is it saves the other half, so 10% of issuance this halving period, or 50% of the 20% dev fee, for other outside developers. And the idea is that each network upgrade, these teams can be recommended by the Zcash Foundation and ratified on network upgrade, and that these teams will be similar to the position that the ECC is in now, in that they will be accountable to the community, and that they will have fairly loose funding in terms of it won't be a grant, and it will be much more loosely specified to improve Zcash. So that does a couple things. One, I think that we need more talent focused on Zcash. So far, I think the strength of talent that the ECC and now the foundation has been a big selling point, but we need to separate that from centralized entities. And I think the other thing it does is it actually is a much more resilient, in my opinion, obviously, structure than we have now, where if there is outside antagonistic involvement, be it via government or another party, going after either the foundation or the ECC, that this structure is resilient to the ECC or the foundation being captured. And so I think that's important as well. Happy to answer questions.
Nathan.
Yes, hello. I'm Nathan Wilcox. I'm the CTO at Electric Coin Company. The question was about the easing function. So I looked at the law spec, but I didn't look at it long enough to get the shape in my mind. So could you just
Sorry,
name?
I messed up twice.
Oh, that's okay. But or can you just describe the intent? Like, what might it look like if the incoming value is worth $1 million per month, or say 750K? Like, how does it
For sure
sort of scale?
For sure. So I'm pacing around a parking lot, so forgive me that I don't have a lookup table, but it's a square root easing function where the square root is used to get the 0 to 1. And so the input to that is over 500K. And the idea is that up to 500K, it's linear. And then after that, it follows that square root easing function. And so I actually included a table in my it's like 50 posts down in the forum post. But I think what you'll notice is, as the amount approaches $1 million, it's on the order of 750 or 800K. And so it's just, the more, it starts slowing down following the square root. So.
Okay, thanks.
Hamid had a question.
Yeah, hi Matt.
Oh,
The easing
introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, I'm a community member, yeah, holder in Zcash and been around for a little bit. Matt, for the easing function, does that only apply to the foundation? So for the other recipients, would they get basically whatever, whatever flows their way?
It actually applies to the foundation and the principal developer. And the idea behind that was a couple. So one, the principal developer is being set aside to sort of have an ongoing monopoly power unless there are like super extraordinary circumstances, versus the other recipients, which could churn as frequently as every 6 months. And so that was the rough idea, is that because those are governance pieces and we don't know that we need them to grow indefinitely, that they both sort of, suffer that easing function.
Okay. Implicitly in the case of the ECC, it's kind of telling them to shrink in a way, right?
Yeah. So I think if you look at it from, and so I'm not the ECC. So if you look at it from the ECC perspective, please take that with a grain of salt. Because really what I mean is, if I were in their position and I were the principal developer, I think what it says to me is a couple things. One, I set those numbers in an attempt to say, like, look, your burn is pretty stiff. I'm not your auditor, but it's a lot of money. I do think that, one, it's reasonable to accept some limits. And two, I'm trying to kind of push a little bit more financial accountability. So instead of we will push and develop Zcash and the price will go up and we'll get more per month, save some more. And as a private company, it's in your interest to put some aside and save, because you know that you're not just going to be getting more and more per month as the coin goes up. I mean, you will, but not as much as a linear curve. Is that clear?
Sorry, I didn't remember that I was muted, but Iran had something to say.
Yes, hi. I'm Eran Tromer. I'm a professor of computer science
Hello.
at University and research scientist at Columbia University and a founding scientist of Zcash and advisor to the Zcash Foundation. And this was a very thought-provoking proposal. I think that the idea of starting with the foundation board and changing and adapting it to current understanding of the community and governance, that's a great direction. I have some reservations about the specific way that things are set up, not as much about the board structure, but about the division of the funds. First and foremost, it seems that these proposals dials the things very extremely towards a decentralization beyond ECC and the foundation, which is great as an aspiration, but it commits to sending at least 50%, more than 50% in case of substantial coin appreciation of the funds to other parties. At current coins price, that means 400K a month. And it is far from clear to me that we have enough contenders who are willing to dedicate their time to Zcash and productively spend $400,000 a month. And this is a hard division in the sense that if there aren't sufficiently many teams that will come up and make good use of these funds, then they cannot be used by ECC or the foundation for other means. And the flip side of that is that ECC and the foundation actually get relatively very few funds compared to the current funding or some other proposals. In particular, the current coin price ECC would get about 200K a month, down from about 700K. So by default, this proposal would starve ECC from 700K down to 200K, meaning a drastic reduction in capacity and headcount, while actually not making productive use with that money, because by default there aren't teams to use it, which strikes me as weird. I mean, I'm all for the accountability and decentralization, but as I wrote in one of my comments, not for cutting off limbs in hope that better ones will grow out. So we need to either be convinced that better use of the funds will be made, or have some mechanism by which the existing players can keep being productive. And this brings us to another aspect that I think is fuzzy, which is the distinction between those over 50% sent to new parties compared to the foundation grants. And they have a lot of commonality in the way that they're administered, and both can be, following the recent discussion, goal and deliverable oriented. So it's not clear what becomes a grant and what becomes another party, and why can't one support the other. I think this needs more clarity and attention. And the last component, we have some election mechanism for one of the board seats, and we don't know how to do elections, right? This is in common with many of the other proposals. I think this, because that component of the board is basically the only part that is tasked with being technically cognizant and making technically informed decisions about what teams can execute, it's crucial to have clarity on how it's composed.
I feel like Matt probably did not mean to leave the meeting just then.
Sorry, guys.
Here we go. All right, Matt.
Briefly going to show you me pacing around a parking lot. Okay, so I'm going to respond to some of this and then kick the rest of the forum in the interest of time. But first, I totally appreciate the comments. We've been discussing some of this in the forum already. So I think, you know, part of what's hard to say is that when we're talking about the difference between grants and upfront funding and the availability of teams, is that if we do not show that there's a significant potential reward for these teams won't exist. And so if my understanding as a private company is that there are $10,000 grants available to work on Zcash versus say $50,000 a month for 6 months, the size of that impact to me and my team is quite different. I appreciate the idea that grants can be larger, but I think that we're also there's also a bit of a difference between cultures here. I'm quite interested in showing a community that our team is of the caliber that we can move Zcash forward, and then being judged by the community on the impact of our work. I'm not as keen on writing grants. And so I think there's a bit of a cultural mismatch. I also think that grant writing and the touch points involved with the foundation are quite different than upfront diligence and then 6 months where the check-ins are with the public rather than the foundation. And the reason that I think those things are different is I'm also looking at how this is working, for example, in the Ethereum community. I'm looking at, and I'm also just, I'm just like looking at my books and how this would impact us. So I do think that it deserves a full written answer. And what I'm going to try to do to talk about grants versus dev fee recipients is actually give you something, a couple, at least rigorous paragraphs, because I think the question deserves it. The other thing that I wanted to touch, and then I'm going to have to kick the rest of the forum, is the idea that this is hamstringing the ECC is a bit off, I think. If we want to decentralize this project, that means making large changes, not small changes. I've made sure that in this structure, the ECC can split into disparate arm's length entities, and continue actually to take 75% of the dev fee. That is not predicated by this proposal at all. You have to remember what we're trying to decentralize, and that's power. And so what's important is not how closely these developers work together. It's fine if the ECC takes the whole dev fee and everyone continues to work closely together. It's decentralizing power and shareholders and board control that matters. And I'm going to have to kick the rest to the forum because I don't want to monopolize here.
All right, Steve and Josh Cincinnati, and please try to keep it quick so that we can start moving on.
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick. That was a great answer, Matt. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Oh yeah, and a brief introduction. I'm Steve. I'm a member of the forums. I've mined Zcash for a while. I stopped when it went to ASIC. I've worked in fintech for years, like data cryptors, HSMs. I currently do reverse engineering and automation, that sort of stuff. We do a lot of cryptography projects, which seem to run parallel to what Zcash is doing with zero knowledge proofs, and we would like to take that technology and use it in our projects. That's where I'm coming from. Now, in regards to your proposal, Matt, what the one thing that worries me about it is you're saying it's trying to decentralize things. To me, one of the problems getting people involved in Zcash has been from I'd say the open source community, but that's not really what I mean. It's people getting paid for doing things. People expect this because there's a corporate structure there. By adding more corporations in, isn't that going to remove or create a disparity with the community when more people are going to expect to be getting paid for doing work rather than just contributing work?
Matt, do you want to take that quickly, and then we'll bounce to
Yep.
Josh?
Yeah, super quick response. I agree. I just think the genie's out of the bottle. I think if I could just control the future, I think the way this would work would be the dev fee recipients would start with a handful of companies, and then over time we would see a greater distance between like company size and contributor size, and that the grants could act as a proving ground for potential dev fee recipients. So that's kind of my ultimate. That's how I'd like to see it work. But yeah, it's a great point.
All right, Josh.
Actually, I'm just going to yield in the name of time because it's not. No, that's okay. I just wrote it. So let's feel free to go on to the next proposal.
I also said something, but in chat, I don't need to talk.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, so I believe that Chris is here. I'm not sure if Mario is here, but I thought since Placeholder's proposal is interesting to compare and contrast with Josh's and Matt's, we should go there next. Hold on, I dropped the link in chat earlier, but it's up thread, so I'm gonna grab it again. Here we go. Okay, sorry about that, guys.
Hi everyone,
Right.
I'm Chris. I work at Placeholder, which is a venture capital firm that specializes solely in decentralized information networks, and Zcash is one of our 3 cryptocurrency positions. I am here, I would say, less to pitch our proposal. I've been talking with a number of the members on this call about ways to merge proposals. I'm sensitive to the fact that after our proposal, a number of investor proposals have been made, and I think that there's a risk that this network upgrade could be viewed as an investor takeover, which is the last thing I think we want for the Zcash community. The reason I've been talking with other members on this call and in part of this call is I think that Zcash, the asset, Zeke, needs more certainty, and the quicker we can come to that certainty, the better. I think the things most on my mind as I look at these proposals, ours included, is number one most important thing to me is that Zcash is interpreted as a flat network where everyone is on the same footing for access to the resource pool. I really think the value of these systems is driven by third-party investment on top of the systems. And so opening up access to the resource pool while continuing to include the ECC and the ZF and the good work they have done, but making sure that we can expand access beyond those two, I think is key. Alongside that access is improved accountability with a focus on execution. I think, just crypto-wide, we can improve on execution, and having different mechanisms for accountability can induce more urgency, which can speed up execution. Regardless of how this decision is made, I've got my eye on the legitimacy of the process. So I think the polling is going to be super important to get out there as we resolve the trademark issue. And the last thing I would say that I'm focused on is also holding the 21 million supply. I think that the interim for Bitcoin, for Zcash, for Decred, which are our 3 cryptocurrency investments, is really serving as a store of value. And if Bitcoin is potentially going to be the winner takes most in that, then having that standard 21 million actually makes it very easy for investors to compare across assets. And so fiddling with the 21 million could start to get us in a slippery territory, or at the very least make it harder to compare and invest. So in terms of some of the proposals that are out there, Matt's included, Avichal's, Josh's, I like the idea of trimming down some of the resource allocation responsibilities of the ECC and ZF to allow each respective foundation or each respective organization to focus, be it on strategic vision, on protocol, on product. And so I've been debating, what is the right decision-making body that relieves some of the weight from the ECC and ZF, while not underappreciating or under-acknowledging the work and expertise that those 2 organizations have. So I can take questions on our proposal if people would like. I'm also happy to discuss some of the points of focus that I just outlined. I think our proposal is a little outdated, but I'll pass it back from here.
Let's hear from someone we haven't heard from yet, since no one is queued. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet who has a thought that they'd like to share here?
I'm willing to share.
Thank you. So Linda, why don't you introduce yourself and then go ahead.
Hi, I'm Linda from ECC. I am on the wallet team, and I particularly never think of the point about the interoperability aspect, and I think that's just a really salient thing to keep in mind. So I'm glad that you brought it up in the proposal. That's it.
Josh Swihart.
Hey, Chris, just a couple questions. One, you mentioned that you were talking with other proposal submitters about merging proposals. So one question is, what have you been looking at in terms of adjustments or merge? And then secondly, was there any more conversations or thoughts around this kind of third party that you were suggesting?
Oh, Josh, did you introduce yourself?
I don't know if I did before. So I'm Josh Swihart, VP of Marketing and Biz Dev at ECC.
Thank you.
So the Blocktown proposal is the one that's closest to our proposal. And so we've been having conversations with them, but have also spoken with Ariana, Matt, Avichal. And while a lot of those proposals are quite different, we can deprecate our proposal and endorse another. So that's been something we've been weighing. I think in terms of a third entity, what I've come to reflect upon is if we're going to introduce a third entity, it makes more sense to me. So the way we set things up with the 2 of 3 is to decentralize things a bit from the ECC and ZF, while not putting all of the risk on a new third entity, because there's a lot of risk there. I think the downside of that is a lot of the burden continues to remain on ECC and ZF, and there's still, say, risky regulatory concentration. And so I don't know that it solves enough of the problems to justify it. I'd be open to opinions on that. And that's where I started to think of either Matt's proposal or Avichal's proposal as lifting some of the decision-making weight off of those 2 organizations to allow them to focus on core competencies. and that's more where I'm currently leaning. But I haven't synced with everyone. I've just been having conversations recently with more of the new proposal submitters.
Who has thoughts? All right, go ahead, Steve. What's your question?
You. Oh, bugger! I've just forgotten it. You were saying that you were talking to Blocktown about that proposal, and you were saying that you were trying to combine the proposals, or you're happy to support somebody else's proposal. Do these all assume that there is going to be continual funding just for 4 years, or is there going to be the need to have this conversation in 4 more years for all of these proposals to work together? So for Blocktowns or for yours, is this conversation going to happen again in 4 years, or is this enough to kickstart everything to get it all going? Do you think, in your opinion?
So hard to say what 4 years down the line is going to look like. I think what I'm hoping to get out of Network Upgrade 4 is a governance framework that the community feels is more inclusive, such that when we are, at Network Upgrade, whatever, 7, 8, 9, in 4 years' time, we have a better structure to make this decision. So I'm not making any presumption about 4 years down the path, but more in the present moment. Let's make sure that we set up the right governance structure such that when we have to make that decision, it's kind of seamless and clearly legitimately made.
Fair point. So I see where you're coming from. So this could go on indefinitely, but if it does, it's going to have some sort of accountability and provability behind it. Yeah,
and I mean, I think the only argument to route more money to the miners is you potentially increase the competition, and you potentially therefore increase the marginal cost of production, which serves as a price floor for proof of work based assets, which I think of commodities. That said, we still exist in a pretty irrational market where these more nuanced pricing dynamics, it's not clear how much impact they have. And so given the technical talent supporting the software development of Zcash, and with additions like Matt Luongo, I think that it would be a missed opportunity to not experiment with on-chain disbursement of funds in a way that's, say, different from what Decred is doing, but similar in some regards, and very much different from what Bitcoin is doing. And so I see it as our momentum is towards, in Zcash, is compensating software development and hardware. And so running, while some people argue there was a different commitment made 4 years ago, and I understand and I'm empathetic to that, if the community's decision at this point in time is let's continue to fund software development and hardware security, then we might as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's answered perfectly. So it's just like, let's start again and let's try and decentralize it a bit more. Thank you very much. I appreciate the answers.
All right, Nathan, you're up. And then Andrew has a question for Chris in chat, but go ahead, Nathan.
Okay. Hello again. I'm Nathan from ECC. My question was, Chris, you mentioned like lifting up some decision making off of ZF or ECC, and I was wondering if you could outline the contours of that, or like give some examples of the kind of decision making you're talking about there.
Sure. So the basic idea is if the ECC and ZF are involved in the overall routing of the network's resources, then that requires those organizations internally come to consensus on all of the possibility of Zcash, as opposed to if those organizations are comfortable with being removed from the decision-making process, then they actually just focus on the things that are their core competencies. Say for ECC, it's both protocol development and application interface, and driving, the focus around executing on those strategies, as opposed to having to get distracted with all those strategies. And so then the routing of resources is outsourced to almost a more macro strategic body, and this is more along the lines of Avichal's proposal, though again, I'm assessing everything. But the point here is slim down the points of focus and decision-making surface area for ECC and ZF, which should free up, some resources, and I think be good for execution.
So Chris, there's a question from Andrew in chat, which I'll just read, which is, what would make us most legitimate? How would you evaluate legitimacy after our upcoming polling on this dev fund debate or some future next polling-like activity that we do? And I guess since I'm usurping Andrew's question, I'll also introduce him. Andrew is the chair of the Zcash Foundation's board and some kind of professor at Urbana-Champaign. I don't know, Andrew, do you want to correct what kind of professor you are?
Nailed it. And yeah, that's fine. I have nothing to add.
Okay, Chris, what are your thoughts on Andrew's question?
So I think the thing that makes things most legitimate is if we get a representative enough poll from the community, even though that poll's not binding, it would be a big breach of trust for the ultimate decision to deviate from what the poll indicates, right? So aligning those two so that the same decision is made would make it most legitimate. I think if there were a deviation, then you could have the community rebel and just feel that decision making was centralized all along. So that's question. Yeah, Sybil resistance from Matt. I think that the polling is a really hard one. For those of you that know me, I also work with the Decred community, and I think that Decred has its own problems with, say, people worried about certain actors holding too much of the Decred supply and therefore having a lot of influence over the votes. But I would say that is probably the most legitimate resource allocation system that I can think of in the space. And I know Zuko and others have made some commentary around proof of stake, and that's a big change. So not the right time to open that can of worms, but long term, I would like to see in a Sybil resistant manner as many stakeholders as possible involved in the decision making and resource allocation of Zcash.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
All right, so I'm sure that people have more thoughts on Chris's proposal, but in the interest of time, we're going to move to Avichal's strategic council approach. So I don't think that Avichal is here. Who is most familiar with this proposal? Sounds like Chris has talked to Avichal about it. I think Matt may have also. So if anyone anyone want to throw their hat in the ring to present the proposal so that we can discuss it?
I can describe it. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's a 5-person strategic council. I believe it's 1 seat minor signaling, 1 seat coin holder vote, and then 3 elected. I think there's potentially a heavy technical lift on the coin holder vote. And so that's its own consideration. But so then it becomes a 5-person strategic council, which is responsible for, for better or worse, setting the strategy. Or wait, someone can correct me. I believe ZF and ECC are also in there, but I might be mixing proposals with Ariana's proposal at this point. But there are a couple 5-person strategic council proposals out there that lift decision making from being directly on ECC and ZF.
Does anyone want to argue for or against this proposal? All right, Antoinette, go ahead. You may be muted. You might have to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, I was muted. Hi, everyone. My name is Antoinette. I was on the last call. I put forth a proposal / blog post about some thoughts that I had from the proposals that I have read. One of my biggest concerns is not so much who is making the decisions from a strategic standpoint, although that is a concern, but more so on how those decisions are made. And in my opinion, it makes me feel more comfortable to be spending a greater amount of time determining the metrics by which the community or strategic council or the community board, existing structures or new structures, are making decisions than who exactly is on those boards. Not to say that that's unimportant, but at least if I'm a community member that's trying to do diligence on decisions that have been made, I can refer back to a framework where there has been consensus on what the metrics to make decisions have already been determined. So that as a benchmark, there's something that we can always refer back to in order to evaluate how well decisions met the original consensus of how we're evaluating the progression of Zcash and what we want to be seeing at a governance level, at a decentralization level, at a technical level, so that my opinion on whether or not the council or the ECC or whomever is the entity creating those decisions can be based off of something that has its permanence in time, if that makes sense.
Iran has a thought.
Yes, I'd like to just outline the space of answers to the question you just asked. One option is to have some body that is actually cognizant in all requisite matters in order to make exactly this kind of judgment about what are the goals and what were the promises, where did they match, whether the execution then matches the goals. And I think this is the attempt of this proposal, as well as several others. And the problem is that forming such a body with people who have the requisite expertise and time is extremely difficult. And this proposal basically punts by invoking the magic word elections and then never actually saying how those are executed. Several other proposals do the same, and I find it hard to even consider these meaningful proposals until those details are fleshed out. Alternatively, one may use existing mechanisms that are already established, essentially the ECC, the Zcash Foundation, that have their own boards and therefore can make some judgments if given some part of the dev fund to manage. Right, that's part of some proposals, the third approach is to try to have some kind of mechanical decisions on whether goals were achieved. And for this, we have actually very few ideas. There is my idea for incentivized shielded adoption that's made it into a portion of Josh Cincinnati's proposal. I can't recall anything else on the table. So this is difficult. I mean, you're asking exactly the right question, and we don't have many good answers to that for the broader set of goals beyond shielded adoption.
Chris, can you read out loud what you just added about Avichal's proposal? Okay, I'll just read it. So Chris posted in the chat, Avichal's proposal of 5-person strategic council, and I think this is a quote, although I'm not positive, for the purposes of voting to determine seats, not having seats vote on issues. One of the 5 seats should be allocated for minors and signaled through nodes. One of the 5 should be ZEC holding weighted. So 1 ZEC equals 1 vote. So that's a staked vote. And 3 of the 5 should be 1 person equals 1 vote. So a standard election kind of vote.
Sorry, I was on mute.
No
So
worries.
that's right. So it's a minor seat, coin holder seat, and then 3 people elected. And as was just pointed out, we don't have a satisfactory election mechanism yet. And then just to contrast this with Autonomous's proposal, which is very similar, but its proposal is EF or ZF has 1 seat, ECC has 1 seat, and then 3 elected as well. I think, I really like the idea of staking and coin holder vote long term. I think that it's a heavy technical lift, and if you're going to go through that process, it's almost it's one of the potential end states of Zcash governance. Nathan or someone more technical on the call that's involved in Zcash engineering would better know whether this could be implemented in time for network upgrade 4.
So Nathan actually has to run right now.
I was just about to run. I could say just off the cuff, I am. It seems unlikely to me in the network upgrade 4 timeline, just off the cuff. Like it might be possible, but it seems like it would be a stretch to do good coin holder voting by that time. I got to run.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yep.
Why don't we hear from someone we haven't heard from yet? Does anyone have thoughts? All right, Jacob, why don't you go ahead and remember to introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Hey guys, so Jacob Phillips, student, finished on my last semester, worked at a crypto fund last summer, currently working for Ariana Simpson at Autonomous Partners right now. We put out we didn't put out a proposal like a zip specifically, but we put out a little post kind of supporting Avichal's proposal with some amendments. We kind of switched a little bit around on how the strategic council is developed, like what the seats are, and then made a minor switch in the election front. But just maybe a quick thought on kind of the macro idea behind Avichal proposal, and kind of the post that we put out was that, Avichal kind of describes in his proposal that where it's coming from is it's coming from him putting on his kind of CEO startup hat and thinking, okay, how is Zcash going to get to where we need it to go? And when I talk with Ariana, one of the big things that she is quick to point out is that, the risk that Zcash is sort of like taken over by someone through an election process or through, through some sort of malicious activity, like someone takes over Zcash from the top and kind of destroys things. That seems like a pretty low risk. The much higher risk, and the thing that I think that we need to worry about maybe a little bit more, is the fact that Zcash just kind of becomes irrelevant. Like people switch to other privacy coins, or this kind of just floats into oblivion. And so one of the things that I think Avichal tries to do in this proposal is create, an entity, in this case, this strategic council, that has full flexibility on funding. And I guess he says that only 33% of funds can go to one entity, but he gives this one entity sort of a little bit of centralization, right? They kind of act as like the startup team who can quickly allocate funds. They can switch on a dime, go a completely different direction. They can, allocate funds here one year, allocate funds a different place another year, and just kind of put Zcash in the position it needs to really kind of step up and achieve the adoption I guess it needs to. Where we came from on our proposal was just, we basically thought that, maybe there was a way we could smooth things out a little bit better. So instead of having sort of, the community basically in Avichal's proposal chooses 4 seats and then miners signal for 1, we switched it around and just said like, hey, let's give 1 to the ECC, 1 seat to ZF initially, and then have 3 that were token holder voting. I think that there's definitely some risks around token holder voting, but at the same time, we have a lot of loud voices in the Zcash community, to the point where I think we would be able to filter out any sort of like malicious people trying to take over things. I think that we could come up with some really good options for people to kind of take over a spot on the council. But with that said, I think that Matt brought up some interesting points, I guess, in how he kind of thought about potential seat allocations, and Josh Cincinnati brought up some other potential options to seat allocation. And I think that the point generally about how the Zcash Foundation board might be a good place to start with isn't not a bad idea by any means, and I think it makes a lot of sense in some sense. I guess the thought is just kind of to manage that trade-off between decentralization, or I guess rather, kind of like doing the risk-off solution, which would be just kind of taking the existing Zcash Foundation board and doing something that's maybe a little more risky, but also a little bit more decentralized and kind of community-focused, like moving towards something like token holder voting. So yeah, thanks.
All right, Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I think that there's kind of like a bit of a meta point, which is I think Avichal's the proposal and the whole strategic council idea is very like startup, right? We want to have a clear, aligned vision, and I appreciate that. That's really strong. But I actually still think that that's I think that we're sacrificing resilience to capture. And I think the struggle with a privacy product is the more successful Zcash is, the more of a prize it will be for outside parties to capture. I actually think this is much more dangerous than what we saw happen to the Bitcoin Foundation. It's not just bad press; it's the introduction of things that could potentially jeopardize people's privacy and maybe one day even liberty. And so I think that's, for me, I think that the risk of a totally de novo council is a little bit too high. And I'd rather see something that, like if the council were shut down, let's say Zcash is wildly successful and the council is shut down by international pressure. Where does that leave Zcash versus some of these other proposals where I think it can kind of keep chugging along?
All right, Steve, or Jacob, do you want to respond to that and then we can jump to Steve? Or should we go straight to Steve? Jacob, I bet you're muted. Oh, okay. Wait, he said go ahead and chat. So Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, just based around stakeholder voting and bringing it in at this early. 50% of the coins haven't even been distributed yet. And 20% of those coins that have been distributed to either the foundation or to the ECC and then passed on via some other mechanism. So it's strongly weighted against anyone who is not part of that group if you start to introduce stakeholder voting before at least either there's no dev fund or 80%, 90% of the coins have been mined. I think it's a good ambition to work towards, but I don't think it's something realistically we can ever hope to achieve in the next 8 years. And responding to Matt, there is a post by Zuko regarding the one miner scenario where you cannot, Zcash is going to get to a state where you cannot censor any transactions going through no matter what happens. The only problem is de-anonymizing the network. So that's all I have to say on that.
Jacob, do you want to respond to Steve?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll just say one thing real quick. I mean, as far as the token holder voting goes, I think that, Steve brings up a good point, and the concerns are reasonable. And if we don't think we can get together sort of a token holder voting mechanism that is going to be fit by the next upgrade next year, so be it, I guess. But at the same time, I think that should be a direction we're probably moving towards. That being my opinion, more so than maybe ASPs. But I think I kind of echo Chris's thoughts on on the idea of token holder voting. I mean, I think it's a good place to move to, and we should think about going that route at some point. If it's not ready for next upgrade, I mean, we can always go to a different direction. The nice part is that there's a number of other proposals out there of how to kind of construct that sort of centralized strategic council, if you will, that ends up distributing a lot of those funds. And I think that, no matter how we there's a number of different ways we can construct it that'll be perfectly fine, right? Like, I think there's a lot of different people in the community who could do a good job allocating funds. And so I don't think it's super, super vital that we end up doing like full token holder voting, but to the extent we can sort of allow for as much community interest, influence on this kind of process as possible, I think that would be desirable.
Thank you, Jacob. Antoinette, would you like to present your proposal and what you're aiming for with it?
Sure. I essentially try to find a way to meet the needs of introducing external developers into the Zcash ecosystem to work on the project. And what I wanted to create was, I wanted to touch upon a few things. The first would be blended mechanisms for funding. So one that's not only focused on miners' rewards. I wanted to ensure that the principal developer, just taking from Matt's terminology, I think that's a great one, but essentially the ECC isn't pulled funding immediately, that we move towards decentralization, but that we create a roadmap that allows us to get there. And it has a focus on metrics and the idea that, and I'm going to harp on this quite a lot, so I apologize for the redundancy, but the idea is that we build metrics as a community before this launch that helps us create that decision making, so that when we are in the process of choosing who to fund or how we want to fund or how much we want to fund certain projects, they're based on metrics that the community has agreed upon, so that within the next 4 years, we're not just talking about moving towards decentralization, but we've actually funded projects that specifically meet things that we want to see. So for example, if we want to see community voting and we want an on-chain mechanism to do that, then there should be a high tendency towards voting on or selecting projects that are offering to work on that problem. The proposal itself is pretty thorough in the kinds of fundings that the kinds of sources of fundings that external developers can tap into. It ranges from just grant funding all the way to equity, which is a little bit more like Matt's proposal, but it's not solely reliant on the founders on mining rewards. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't want to ramble for too long. It's pretty thorough.
All right. We don't have anyone queued at the moment, so someone should jump in with their thoughts. Josh Swihart just asked in chat, what's your expected timeline for polling the community? I don't have exact dates for you all yet, but I will very soon, and I'll communicate those as soon as I can, probably in the next couple of days. Iran, since you have posted raise his hand, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. One is, how can we get confidence that the amount of investments from the crowdsourcing parts will be significant? We know some projects that have not had much success, and the Zcash Foundation grant program has also been mainly funded by the Zcash Foundation through the Founders Reward. So we would need to see very different dynamics for that component to be quantitatively significant. And the other question is, on the investment part, do we expect much of the effort that we are aiming for to actually be monetizable, as opposed to things that are a public good that is actually very difficult to monetize, especially if you insist on doing it in a privacy-preserving way?
I'm not muted. I'm not quite sure I understood the last question. I'll start with the first. So it's fair. Crowdfunding is a little bit of a risk. It can result in not enough funds to actually hold a fund that would result in enough revenue. If we blend some of what Matt proposed, the idea of burning excess instead of burning, that excess money could go into the endowment structure in order to act as a complement to crowdsourcing. The reason why I like crowdsourcing is because it incentivizes the community to put skin in the game. And it also shows it's a little bit of a metric for the ECC and the Zcash Foundation to see the health of the community. Just one metric, but that can be debated. And for the second question, would you mind repeating? I lost it a little bit.
So my concern is that maybe a lot of what we need to happen is a public good that cannot be monetized. You know, someone writes open source software, no one is going to pay them significant money that will create revenue, that will create profits, that will make it a good investment. We've seen many people trying to create online services and wallet software and not being able to recoup their costs. And especially when we are trying to do everything in a privacy-preserving way, that creates extra technical constraints that make it more difficult to turn a profit.
Sure, but what I'm not understanding from your question is why would that matter? For the funding is not predicated on the projects that we fund making money. These are grant funding, so we're not looking to earn an investment on those projects. The investment fund would be investing in traditional money markets that earn a return. You can put parameters.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. You can put parameters around that, right? We can say we want the investment dollars to go into something that drives the community forward, and then we can put parameters around that. But we're not looking to derive money from the startups or the early stage businesses that are receiving money from the source of funding.
Why don't we hear from someone who we either haven't heard from for a while or haven't heard from at all yet?
I can go.
Yeah, go for it, Linda.
As someone in product and as also someone from ECC, this is a little bit, it's like, ooh, spicy, but I still really love the idea of results-based financing. And I love all of the recommendations that you have. And I think that allowing the crowd to actually contribute some funds not only diversifies the funds, but like you said, allows them to participate. So I like it. I'm not speaking on behalf of ECC, but just me.
Yeah. I mean, I think results-based financing takes away the trust a little bit in the individual that's elected and puts it more into metrics. The issue, and I put this in my proposal, is that you really have to either hire or have the expertise in-house and appoint that person to be solely devoted to working with the community, ECC and Zcash Foundation, external developers, miners, the entire ecosystem to develop those metrics that seem fair and that are meaningful. So that when we're measuring our results and we're financing projects, they're based on metrics that everybody generally has some sort of consensus on. But I appreciate the compliment. Thank you.
Yep, and I don't hire anyone, and I have not too much power, but that I feel like hiring one person to do that, if we're really saying we want to decentralize, doesn't seem like too much of an ask. That's also my opinion.
Matt.
Yeah, I was just gonna throw out really quickly that there are a ton of ideas here that I like, and I think the biggest lift with this proposal is actually getting language sorted out, because we're coming from like very different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so so like I'm not familiar with results-based financing, and there's been like I have not completed all of the Googling I plan to do. So I just wanted to throw out that I think there are a lot of good ideas in here, and I also wanted to thank you, because I'm probably going to steal a couple more things from you too. So.
Cool.
Bam Bam, do you want to introduce yourself and then say whatever you got to say?
Sure. Can you see and hear me?
We can hear you. Linda's sharing her screen so that people can look at the proposal.
Okay, great. Yep, so I'm the director of security for the Electric Coin Company. I have a history of like technical security, security and finance. So I've worked for lots of international banks doing pen tests for them and that kind of stuff. This isn't an interview for me, so I'm not going to go into all my details of my background, but I guess probably what I wanted to say was that I've seen companies who have a history of completely organic growth of their networks and their software by commission to unrelated contracts in the past. And one of the tasks that I've done for large international banks, for instance, is asset discovery, because they literally don't know what's connected to their network. I'm not saying we would get to that state, but yeah, it can cause a little bit of chaos if you're trying to parallelize and make these tasks as small as possible so that everyone could be involved. So it's just a bit of a warning from the security front, I suppose.
Does anyone have further thoughts? Maybe now would be a good time to bounce to another proposal and continue with the comparing and contrasting that we've been doing. So next up, I tried to group some of these, as you may have been able to tell, based on similarities in approach so that we could have them fresh in our minds. And the next one, let's look at Aristarchus's proposal, which is a 20% split between the ECC and the foundation. So here's the link. Does anyone want to step forward to speak for this? If not, I can give a brief summary. All right, so I'll cue us up here. The general spirit of this proposal is what it sounds like. I believe it's scoped to the next 4 years. And the idea is to have a dev fund of 20% of mining rewards and split it between the ECC and the foundation. And it also mandates that there be a voting system. And in 6 specification, it lays out the requirements of the voting system. Although it's not a complete spec, but it has parameters. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but feel free to read them if, you know. Do people feel like they have a general understanding of what this proposal is and does? Or rather, if someone doesn't understand it, maybe chime in and we can all collectively clarify.
This seems like really straightforward to understand. Sorry I didn't put myself in the queue. I'm sharing my screen, but teehee.
So what does everyone think? I would say I would invite people, if you either have an opinion in favor or against, please speak up and share it. Antoinette, go ahead.
Sorry, I just spoke, but I don't know if we're still doing that rule, Sonia, but I really am against an arbitrary timeline or an arbitrary split of funds for the sake of decentralization or for the sake of solving this problem. The last thing that we want is to make decisions that aren't based on the reality of what are the actual costs related to each organization, what are they expecting to do, and what is the value that they're bringing in, and then what is the addressable market that would be requiring funds to be working on projects. So earlier on in this chat, there is an understanding, or I have an understanding, that there's concern around there being enough proposals that are of enough quality to intake all of the funding that might be going towards external developers, while simultaneously pulling funding from a team of developers, the ECC and Zcash Foundation, that are already working on meaningfully adding to Zcash. So for me, any proposal that has a split like this or a deadline like this makes me really concerned.
Matt, it seems like you have thoughts. Do you want to speak up?
Sorry, I'm saying I'm here. So, I mean, I think the thought is just that this is
Matt, I think your audio, yeah, your audio is breaking up or something like that.
He might be gone.
All right. Well, while Matt presumably attempts to fix whatever's going on with his audio, does anyone else have a thought?
I might be back.
You certainly sound clearer, yeah.
Excellent. No, I was just going to say, I think this is an opportunity for the community to actually weigh in and improve the status quo a little bit and add some accountability and resilience. And so I think that, you know, this feels like a kick the can proposal. I mean, I like that it does something, and I would rather kick the can than not kick the can. But you know, I would rather us be strategic about the future than kick the can.
So unless anyone has a burning desire to chime in here, I think it doesn't seem like we have a lot to discuss here. So let's move to Dimitris Apostolou's proposal, which is a Zcash community funding system. And it's based on the Monero forum funding system. The idea is essentially to have crowdfunded bids for work. Sort of similar to a grant system or a bounty system. Does anyone have thoughts?
I didn't read it yet. No thoughts.
Okay, Steve has a vote of confidence. I will, just speaking for myself, not the foundation, I personally don't think this is a viable option. Or rather that if we went with this option, Zcash would probably survive, but be largely irrelevant, at least for, you know, at least for 5 to 10 years. And that would be sad. So I personally think that this wouldn't work. Does anyone disagree with me?
Yeah, why can't it be added onto other proposals?
Steve, I don't think we can hear you very well.
Why can't it be added onto other proposals? The whole idea behind this, I thought, was to get money from the community rather than from the blockchain.
I mean, it could be done. This could be done independent of other like it doesn't really need. This doesn't need a protocol change to be created. Iran notes in chat that Zcash Foundation grants already sort of do this.
Yeah, kind of.
Razik, why don't you introduce yourself and then share your thoughts?
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Razik. I'm from Arcadia. We're a software dev company out of Dallas. So I've seen a couple of different coins attempt to implement the same style as Monero. And what usually ends up happening is that with those different coins, they ran into issues in terms of having the same level of activity in terms of community donations. Also, it might be good to look at who on the Monero side, like what kind of entities are donating versus what kind of entities we have active inside of the Zcash community in comparison in terms of would we get the same kind of results on that side. But that's just my 2 cents.
All right, so I'm getting the sense that we don't have a lot to say about this one either. So now this is the speak now or forever hold your peace moment. Why don't we talk about Blocktown's proposal, which is similar to Placeholders, but the thrust of the proposal is about they want to limit a protocol-based dev fund to 10%. Other people have been largely discussing 20% and then allocating that in various ways. But Blocktown advocates for a 10% of mining rewards. And I believe this is also scoped to 4 years. But now I'm also recalling, yes, I think this is basically Placeholder's proposal, but 10%. Does anyone have thoughts on the 10% idea? Is it good, bad, somewhere in between?
Can you explain some more? What's the placeholder?
I can explain the idea behind 10%. The idea behind the 10% is from the placeholder from the proposal is that they will it's eventually going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping, and one of the things that was mentioned on the forum was that if it stays at 20% now, that sets a precedent for it to be 20% forever. That was one of the things behind the proposal.
Linda, the way in which it's like the placeholder proposal is that it has this third entity. And gosh, I'm trying to remember exactly what the third entity does. I think we're probably all in feeling like me, trying to keep straight all the different details here.
Oh my gosh, this is what they do. Sorry, it's a lot. Okay.
Yeah. Does that kind of explain things?
Sure. I can just read later.
Yeah.
I've read them all, so if you've got questions, I can answer it.
How do people feel about the 10%? I want to ask that again. Maybe can someone from ECC chime in here? Perhaps Josh Swihart or DC.
What's the specific question?
Do you think it would be? Do you think a 10% of block rewards for 4 years would be viable for Zcash? I believe you said no in the ECC assessment, but I can't remember.
No, we didn't. We didn't say no. We don't know at this point whether or not it would be sufficient. We're going to cover. We have a live stream scheduled for next Tuesday, and we'll go into a little bit of financials and potential impacts during that call. But we can't say right now whether or not 10% with some whether or not that would be sufficient for funding.
Okay, fair enough.
If I recall correctly, this proposal is the same as placeholders. The only difference is the percentage of funding.
Yeah, I believe that's true. All right, Matt, why don't you make your comment and then we'll move on.
Yeah, super quick. I just think the rationale for lowering to 10% is, I mean, it feels a little arbitrary. Like, look, we're setting a standard going forward that will decrease this, but it doesn't actually put a stake in the ground and make sure that happens in future halving periods. So it just feels just as arbitrary. And I feel like we've got a shelling point around 20%. And if we are going to lower that, then it should have something to do with the USD price rather than just kind of like wanting numbers to look different for sort of like, I mean, basically the rationale that I was given is that it's closer to Bitcoin if the dev fee is smaller, which I think is a little ridiculous. So, but I mean that in the most respectful way.
Thanks, Matt. So now we have LexNode's dev fund supplemental proposal, enforce dev fund commitments with legal charter. And I believe the TLDR here is requiring involved entities to sign on to this charter that has some obligations attached to it. If anyone is more familiar with the details, they should feel free to chime in here. Do people think this is a good idea? Various other proposals also have legal aspects or legal requirements. How do people feel about that? Okay. If no one has any thoughts to share here, we can move on. So now we have a definite, intentionally explicit kick the can proposal, which is Wait, sorry. I may have moved on too quickly. I see some discussion here in the chat. Does anyone want to verbally start discussing? All right. We're going to. Oh, sorry. Was someone about to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, for the legal one, what jurisdiction would it be enforced in? Because if we're all around the world, then that might lead to some issues in terms of actually enforcing anything.
America, where the companies are registered.
Yeah,
That
it
makes
would.
sense. Thank you.
Yeah, that does have it, but it makes sense to have it be in America where the entities are, because they're governed by that jurisdiction. Okay, so we're moving on to Keck's fund ECC for 2 more years proposal. I'm not sure, given that I don't think ZF or ECC would accept this proposal. I'm not sure how in depth we should discuss it, but if people have thoughts, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's basically an extension of the existing Founders Award as a dev fund for 2 years, with the intention of working it out then. So once again, if anyone wants to argue for or against, all right, Antoinette, what do you think?
So this is an ideal state. We want to move forward and make progress, but I rather extend a deadline and and throw down metrics that would enable us to get to a place where we can either vote or set up a council or create an endowment fund and have a proof of concept or something, than pull the funding and pick some of the other kick the can options that I think would just render Zcash unimportant.
All right, so here's the chime in or forever hold your peace moment. All right, so now, Steve, we have one of your proposals up, which is keep the block distribution as initially defined, 90% to miners, which is basically a no extension or no replacement of the Founders Award. So Steve, do you want to go into that a little bit more? And I guess we should consult the GitHub version.
Yeah, which one of this is this the first one or the second one? Wait a minute, can I just pull it up on my PC? One sec.
It's keep the block distribution as initially defined.
Okay, one sec. Sorry, I was busy a second ago. I had something else I had to do. Yeah, so does anyone disagree with this? Should the Founders Reward continue?
I don't think the Founders Reward should continue, but I personally do think we should have a development fund.
Okay, this doesn't preclude a development fund. This just says the Founders Reward has to stop. What it also says is that mandatory enforced donations are not actually donations. And yeah, so enforcing any kind of mandatory donation by whatever mechanism would be seen as continuation of the Founders Reward.
So then this does preclude protocol-based funding then, right?
No. As long as it's not mandatory, as long as it's voluntary, you can do what you want.
Okay, I see what you mean. Antoinette, since we've heard from you a few times, why don't we let Jack talk and then you can chime in after.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jack, or Strad, out to both. I'm a cryptographic engineer at the Electric Coin Company, and hack on various other aspects of it besides. Just replying to that point there, if it's not in, a voluntary, like a donation-based funding system is not a development fund, because, or rather, it is indistinguishable from just people creating transactions and sending things. So there is, in fact, a distinction between a development fund that is generated by and enforced by the consensus rules, and a development fund that is donation based. And then sort of as a related point, not specific to this, but more generally amongst all the proposals, like while I've got the stick, something that I've noticed across most of the proposals thus far is that they are a little ambiguous as to exactly which parts of the ZIP are intended to be enforced by the consensus rules, and as in the network consensus rules, and which parts are intended to be enforced by governance rules. Now, this specifically, I'm thinking of the more recent proposals around, like, oh, well, we'll burn or lock up or send back to past or future miners funds and things like that. The proposals need to be clear as to what it is that they expect to be encoded in the network rules that we then go ahead and implement, versus what is expected to be subject to the jurisdiction of whatever governing body is and therefore is at the discretion of more of the legal enforcement side of things. Because it matters then when it comes to people like me who have to actually implement it.
Steve, do you have thoughts on Strad's comment?
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to your first comment, which was about it being in the protocol and voluntary compared to mandatory. I think that's a mildly semantic point. I love you, man. You get me on the forum every single time on this. I think it's brilliant. I hate you for it, but it is brilliant. But the point is the protocol can take money from miners. The protocol can take money from people who send transactions. The protocol can take money from wherever the protocol gets access to it, and it's putting mechanisms in place in other places than just the miners. So transaction fees. I mean, the next proposal we can go on to is about the indefinite source of wealth. If this is going to be 500 years long, you're not going to have a block reward of 500 years. That's a different proposal.
All right, that sounds like a discussion that should be hashed out further on the forum for the sake of precision and also for the sake of not getting bogged down. So Josh Swihart, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, after a year's worth of work and a lot of back and forth of emails and negotiations, I am finally in the possession of a trademark donation agreement signed by both Zico and Josh Cincinnati. So we have that done, which is awesome.
Woo! That's awesome. Well, everybody look out for announcement blog posts after this call.
Is that going to be on the official ECC means of communication?
Yeah, we are publishing a blog post as we speak and publishing the PDF, so you'll be able to review that.
I'll be probably a little later than that. All right. So after that happy interlude, does anyone else? Oh, Antoinette, you had something to say, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So Steve, what do you think about because we have a dev fund, we have the original dev fund at 20%, and I think that the brilliance of that was a big word, but I think the strength of my proposal is that it actually allows for the dev fund to become obsolete, but over time. So say, for example, we have a dev fund of 20%, and there are 4 external developers that qualify to take some of that equity. So they get 5% each. Now the community will mandate that of that 5%, I drew a picture, but I don't think anybody's gonna be able to see it. Probably not. I'm gonna drop the picture. But of that 5%, we mandate that 0.5% of the 5% goes to the endowment fund, right? So the endowment fund is the fund that funds all of the external developers for like grant projects or smaller term projects. They're not equity funding. And it's a sustainable source of funding because we're investing in other market assets. So it's supposed to be a self-sustaining fund. And over time, so we had a 20% dev fund. Then that 4 developers got, really high quality work, and they each got 5%. Of those each 5%, a percentage of that, so 0.5 of that went to the endowment fund. The endowment fund is dishing out funds for more projects. And then eventually what will happen is other developers and other teams will come at those 5% holders, and they will then take a portion of that equity. And then that'll happen again and again and again until eventually the money would be decentralized, the equity funding would be decentralized, and the majority of it would have had filtered into an endowment fund. So I know that you don't want a dev fund. I think that eventually that makes sense, but I'd like to see the dev fund be reduced over time as the quality of projects increase. So we have one set of money, which is the endowment fund, to get people working on the project, start building that skill base, get people interested. Like somebody mentioned at the beginning of the call, if there's 10,000, if there's 10K available, then more developers might be interested. But it happens gradually and progressively over time.
I agree, and I like the idea of the endowment fund, and I'm not trying to not fund the ECC. It's in my interest for the Zcash technology to proceed, and I see the ECC as the best way of doing that. But the founders' reward has to stop, and when that has to stop, I believe mandatory, or it's not a donation if it's mandatory. It's as simple as that. It's a tax. It's just like the license tax. I believe you should be extracting that from more sources than just the miners. If it feels like, because if you scare them off, then you've got no one. You've got nothing left to secure the network. Nothing left on the network. But I agree with the idea of the endowment fund and something then being able to regenerate money back into itself. I think that's a very good idea.
All right, Matt.
Okay, you're going to hear some kids who do not want to eat their dinner behind me. But yeah, so I just wanted to toss out, I don't know if, maybe this is a little short-sighted, but I actually don't think a development fund that gets smaller over time is a valuable idea. Part of the reason, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, but I don't think that it makes sense for Zcash, because I think I'm looking at the whole market and I'm thinking about differentiation. And, we have to talk about Bitcoin. We have to talk about folks that we think will exist for the next 4 years. So I see a dev fund that continues to be funded as a strong differentiator between Zcash and Bitcoin. And I think to Andrew's question about metrics, so this is not rigorous. If it had been, I would have tried to write it up in a proposal. But numbers that I care about, I want to see a larger number of independently maintained clients. I'd like to see some idea of developer awareness. And then I like the idea of having more dev teams, but I mean, anytime we're talking about more people, Sybil bothers me. So it's easy for me to think of having more independent clients, but it's more difficult for me to imagine just trying to pump up more dev teams. And maybe, I guess sorry about it, I'm on a call. Maybe there's one other thing, which I think is some idea of, how much is being built atop Zcash. So for example, like it would be nice to see more, this is a random example, but like more retail products built on top Zcash, or whatever sector we think is interesting, as well, in addition to core work. Finn.
Was that towards me?
I'm sorry, I forgot that I had muted myself. Andrew, can you present your proposal?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to, and I wouldn't probably even want to spend too much time on it. I still think that there are some important things to consider with having miners included in this kind of discussion, but I think a lot of the other first of all, there's not very much new on this proposal since the last time we talked about it. I think the other proposals that we're talking about now are really interesting and good because they are closer towards talking about like what metrics we would use. Even if we were to use a miner-directed proposal or miner-directed control over the dev fund, we would still have to have exactly these same conversations to provide any sort of guidance or coordination, about what it is that miners would ratify or affirm. I noticed that I don't think that there are any representatives of mining on this call. I would almost say that the kind of people that show up on this call are similar to the ones that are represented in some way by the community governance panel. So I'm intrigued by the discussions about, and I realize I'm just going off the rails and not even talking about this proposal, but just responding. Maybe that's fine, I can do that. I like the question about like what it is that would make the voting or polling kind of efforts that we do representative. So, I mean, I feel like that the direction that makes the most sense to me is I like all of the proposals that involve like a slow evolution of the board and incorporating more forms of trying to do representative election to make the, say, foundation board more legitimate by having more incorporation of election style things into it. If we just keep going in the same direction that we have, that would suggest that we do like a very slow turnover of foundation board seats to the output of polling things. So like we had one board election with 2 seats going to people chosen by the community governance panel. So maybe if we kind of established a norm of like 1 from existing Z Fund and 1 from ECC and then 3 seats chosen, staggered or whatever by community governance panel, or eventually try to make it to community governance panel and then something on stakeholders. So it's kind of tricky, but I can imagine that even if we just go in the same direction, then that is the kind of things that we would be doing. So I welcome the feedback on like what metrics it is that we would set anyway, and on like what would be, representative, or how we'd evaluate how representative we're achieving by doing these polling experiments. Okay, I'm yielding.
Josh.
Just one reference point on miners. I mean, I think we've seen obviously the miner demographic change shift pretty dramatically with ASICs entering the network. And I've had conversations with a couple. Most recently, I had a conversation with one in Beijing a couple weeks ago. And the point they made to me was they don't care. For them, this isn't about Zcash. Mm-hmm. This is about making money. And so as long as they can make money, I think that's probably true of some of the larger ASICs miners, which I think is different than maybe a lot of the GPU hobbyist miners that we had in the past.
All right. Antoinette, you wanted to say something about metrics again?
No, I don't want to say something about it, but I mean, for the first time in both of these conversations, I was able to write down metrics that matter to the community. And I think that it's worthwhile sometimes stepping away from proposals and just talking about what we want to see in the next 4 years might shed some light on which aspects of proposals are actually in line with what the community wants. So if independently maintained clients is something that people are interested in, then I would like to hear more about what these metrics are. And I know it's taking us away from the protocol conversation, Sonia, but
that's fine. We only have 3 more specific proposals to discuss, so we can talk about metrics. And this sounds like something that it would be good to do note taking on. Is anyone other than me, since I need to focus on moderating, can anyone take notes on this? Okay, Linda has unnominated herself. Okay, Antoinette, thank you. Maybe we can have multiple note takers. That would be great. Oh, it is being recorded. That's a good point. I kind of forgot about that. All right, so I can start here. I'm very interested in more shielded transactions. Does anyone else have a thought here? Iran.
I also like it.
And I think something that might be, Matt said, I also like it. I think another thing that might be good to look at is, I'm not sure what the right way to measure this would be, but e-commerce for Zcash, and maybe number of shops, although that's gameable. I don't know, it gets difficult. Okay, so Matt has a thought, and then Andrew has a thought. I'm actually going to switch that because Matt, we've heard from you a lot. No offense. So Andrew, why don't you go ahead, and then Matt can chime in.
Sure. Hopefully it's just a couple tiny points, and hopefully we can do more talking about the metrics maybe at the end as well. But I think we would agree that there are like metrics that are just say too low level, like succeed in reaching some kind of update in the next 6 months, like staying to the developer cycle. And I think we would probably all agree that like just setting a metric on price, for example, or on number of users making all of transactions, something like that is difficult because it's not, I don't know, directly the consequence of the things that we do. So I think that the metrics need to either be somehow in the middle of those, or I don't know, different in some other dimension that I haven't been able to think of so clearly yet.
All right, Matt, and then Antoinette.
I'd like to yield to Antoinette. If I could go after, that'd be awesome. But
okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I feel like I opened this can of worms. I do facilitate like workshop facilitation. If we can create just a baseline, the idea is to brainstorm on metrics where there's no wrong answers. We're just brainstorming, we're putting it all out there. Then we can start getting vigorous about what metrics mean. There are things like vanity metrics, which Andrew, you were touching upon. Vanity metrics don't help, especially in terms of a startup, but that's stage 2. Like, I think let's just get it all out there and get it on paper or get it recorded. And then we can start talking about what qualifies metrics and how should they be weighted. And we can go into layers of detail.
All right, that sounds good. Matt, and then Iran.
yeah, so totally down to brainstorm. But before brainstorming, a condition. I think it's really important that we separate what's easy to Sybil and what's not. And I want to make sure that whatever metrics we use that are easy to game and Sybil attack, that we don't tie a bunch of incentives on it. So shielded adoption, this is my biggest problem with it. I think we all want to see shielded adoption, but it's very easy to fake. And so tying money to it, I think, is a little bit dangerous. And then just to throw out the other stuff, independent clients, more core developers, even if that's not attached to a particular development team, more products built atop Zcash. And so I think a really obvious one is like there's not a lot of payment infrastructure. There's not much in terms of L2 on top of Zcash. Yeah.
All right, Iran, you're up.
So just to help frame the discussion, which I really like, there are metrics here which we share with essentially all cryptocurrencies, adoptions, merchants, usability, latency, and so forth. Let's make sure we're not reinventing the wheel. I expect that out of the many thousands of cryptocurrencies out there, some have already mapped this out. And then there are the things that are unique to us and to what we're trying to do here. Things like shielded adoption, and there are various ways to measure it. There are, for example, shielded transaction volume, which is trivial to spoof, but also the fraction held in Z addresses, which is actually impossible to spoof in the sense that even if a few people move a lot of funds to Z addresses, that's actually meaningful and indicates we've made some progress in high security custodian solutions or whatever those people need. So there are these things. And then there's also features. You can call them metrics measuring features, if you will, that we can think about that are specific to our case, like enabling privacy-preserving transactions in custom assets, so privacy-preserving smart contracts, things that we should think about on the roadmap and that tie very strongly with the mission of financial privacy and why we've got it here. I'd like to spend as much as possible of our effort and focus and resources on the things that make us unique.
Josh, I think it's you now.
Great, thanks. Hi again, everybody. Yeah, actually, the thing that I was going to say is exactly what Steve was saying in the chat, which is I think that one way of creating an ungameable shielded adoption metric is having funds predicated on like T address deprecation, because if everyone in the ecosystem is comfortable enough to move forward with living in a purely Z to Z world, and we're good to go on removing T addresses entirely. If we all come to that sort of broad consensus, it's a binary metric, of course, but I think that that's one way to I think, and in my view, it really is truly, to Ron's point, it's the most important differentiator and the key thing that we should be driving toward. And that's one way to make it something that is like impossible to be gamed at that point.
I think we are out of queued people. So at will, share a thought.
I'd like to chip in. My name is Jack Gavigan. I'm also known as Dodger, to differentiate myself from Strad, the other Jack. I'm part of the I'm an employee of the Electric Coin Company, and I've been involved in Zcash since shortly before it was launched. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Electric Coin Company here. This is purely personal thoughts. One thing I wanna highlight during this talk on metrics. I think there are three approaches to directing a potential dev fund. One approach is, and I think it's safe to say that this is the pitch that ECC has made, which is basically to hire someone to perform a job, and in the context of ECC and Zcash, ECC has performed the job of stewarding Zcash and developing it and making improvements and so on for the past 3 years. There's then a situation where you go, right, I want to see this feature, I want to see this outcome. So I want someone to make me a mobile wallet, say for example, and then you either hire that person or you reward that person based on that outcome, and that's a kind of a binary outcome. And there's a certain amount of in the first instance where you're hiring someone, you're implicitly trusting their judgment, you're implicitly trusting that their experience and that their approach to doing the job is the right one, and you're effectively giving them a huge amount of power and judgment. And the second one, you decide what you want done, and you're simply probably hiring the best person or the cheapest person for that. And that's important to note then that you've already decided what you want done. Whether you're the best person to make that decision is a different question. And then finally, there's this metrics based approach, which is similar to the second option, in that you're looking for an outcome. You want to achieve a specific metric, and you're rewarding someone based on the extent to which they deliver on that. And that, I think, is the worst of all possible situations, because number one, you've made the decision that this metric is the important one. Number two, you're effectively blindly incentivizing them based on achieving that metric, and there's no judgment involved in evaluating whether blindly maximizing for that metric is the right approach. And I'll give you an example. If you want to maximize shielded use on Zcash, a really simple way of doing that is to simply deprecate T addresses. Just been talked about it. However, if you were to do that tomorrow, Zcash would probably be delisted from almost every exchange that currently lists it. And there would be practically no usage of Zcash other than those people who are able to run their own full nodes, and a few people who are running wallets. So I think that when we're talking about the outcomes that we want to achieve, we need to be super careful about the unintended consequences. Yes, we do want to see greater shielded adoption, but if you blindly incentivize that, then you run the risk of someone achieving that outcome, achieving that goal, achieving that metric, and getting rewarded for achieving it, but actually having an incredibly negative impact on Zcash and its adoption in a more strategic sense. And I'll finish there.
Was anybody queued? I'm sorry, I've forgotten. I don't think so. All right, Steve, why don't you share your thoughts? And then Antoinette, it sounds like you might also like to chime in, but I'm not positive. So Steve, what did you have to say?
Yeah, it was just about that last comment. I really like what you had just had to say, Dodger. I thought that was a really good talk. Well, one thing I would say though is the metrics would be a lot more nuanced than just the depreciate T addresses. If that was a metric, then yes, that would be very easily gained. But it would have to be more well defined than that. Is what I was expecting from that. I think people are just throwing grandiose sort of ideas out there that are all encompassing, then are waiting for the refinements later. But I completely agree with your concerns. They're very valid. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Really.
Elena, why don't you go ahead, and then Antoinette, I'm still not totally sure whether you actually want to talk, so let me know in chat. But Elena, and introduce yourself, please.
Hey everybody, this is Elena. I am on the growth and marketing team at ECC. And this is, Sonia, probably something that is kind of peripheral or adjacent to the proposal conversation. But, and I'm sure the foundation will figure out kind of how votes will be tallied. But one thing I just want to bring up is that seems to be a lot of proposals, and then I don't know how many proposals there are relative to actual voters. So if everyone votes for their own proposal, how many other people, undecided, how would that sway the decision or the discussion? So that's just something that I've been thinking about in the background, and I'm not sure if anybody has opinions or thoughts on how to shed light on that.
I think we're probably going to have some of these proposals either drop out or merge. And then also the way that we're currently planning to frame voting, which please don't consider this a 100% commitment, but this is our current plan, is to present each proposal and say, would this proposal be acceptable? Yes, no, abstain. And we're going to do that for each proposal. So this is kind of a variant on approval voting. Basically, the idea is to identify which proposals, what amount of people in these various signaling methods find acceptable. And if you want to get more details on who we're planning to ask and how, I can grab the link to the blog post where Josh went into it. Does that make sense?
That is awesome. And then also, yeah, that's perfect. I'll read the blog post because I don't think I've seen it yet.
So the number of people on the community advisory panel is, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think it's around 60, maybe between 50 and 60. So I've completely lost track of the queue. It sounds like at some point Josh Cincinnati wanted to say something. Steve, maybe you would like to chime in also. Okay, who? Antoinette, I think it's you.
I had a comment just to respond to Jack, but I don't know if we want to jump back to that conversation at this point.
We can jump around a bit. That's fine.
Okay. Jack, I think that was expressed very clearly and very effectively, and I appreciate you breaking that down. I think metrics it's a hairy topic. It's a big word that can mean a lot of different things, especially when it comes down to how it's measured and how they're defined. However, I would like to draw a point of differentiation between outputs and outcomes. Typically, we think of metrics, or in my experience, I've seen metrics being determined as outputs. How much have we increased our network? How many shielded transactions are there? And oftentimes these metrics, as you said, can be arbitrary. We don't know and they don't pivot. And we are incentivizing people to work in certain ways, absolutely. But the idea is to understand what are the outputs that we're looking for, and then to be able to take all of those metrics, those outputs, and aggregate that into actual outcomes. And we would associate the outcomes with the allocation of funding. So I'm not looking to fund somebody claiming to increase the network by X number. I'm looking to fund a project that's seeking to address this output, which then trickles down into, this outcome, which then trickles down into these outputs. So I don't think that you and I are in disagreement. It's just a matter of framing, and I don't want the conversation of metrics to be left here, because I'm seriously concerned with making decisions on how much funds we're allocating or taking away from the Zcash Foundation and from ECC without having a clear understanding of what are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve and how are we going to be making these decisions. And that could completely be an ignorance on my part. I perhaps haven't read a document that I should have read, but it seems to me that we there is not a consensus and there is not a clarity on metrics at an output level and on an outcome level. And but we're having a conversation of where we're allocating funds, and it's just tough for me to handle that decision without understanding the roadmap.
All right, so Dodger, why don't you go ahead and respond there, and then Iran has a point to share.
I'll let Iran go first.
Okay, Iran, you're up.
All right. So going back to the voting on the proposals, I wonder what happens if the winning proposal actually misses essential components, like having defined elections or entities. How do we play from that point on?
Do people have thoughts? Josh, especially if Josh Cincinnati, if you're still here, this might be a good place for you to chime in. Because I don't think we have a answer here, but maybe Josh does.
Actually, sorry, I was looking at another window, and I was hoping you could repeat the question, Iran. I apologize.
Sure. So suppose we figured out how to do the voting, we have the proposals, and the winning proposal has an entity that is ill-defined or just refers to ill-defined elections. What happens then?
I mean, I think we have to use our best judgment to assemble that entity to the best of our ability, based off the community's will. At least that would be my interpretation. And that probably means doing so like under the auspices of the current organizations that exist, aka the ECC and the foundation. That would be my view, but I don't know if that is either a satisfying or accurate answer to that question, because I mean, it could be that our the foundation board feels otherwise, or that folks at the ECC or members of the community feel otherwise. But I think that, yeah, we do our best to fulfill the spirit of the proposal.
But what does it mean to have an elections? I mean, if we could do elections, we could make every decision using the same mechanism, and we wouldn't even be having this Hangout call. I mean, there are many proposals that basically punt into ill-defined terms that are not any easier to implement than the decision we started off with.
I think that's a fair point, and those concerns, I think, need to be handled by the people proposing. Proposing those things first and foremost before before we agree to implement them. But in the case that they're not, there probably needs to be a period of time and more feedback for what those bodies might look like. But I don't know. I'm very open to hearing what others have to say about it.
I have an informational comment about the zip process, since neither Dara nor George is here, which is that a big part of the zip editor role is helping to have a further specification of proposals. That's usually oriented towards the tech side, so I'm not sure how that part of the zip editor role will apply to these like legal and economic and governance questions. But that is something that George and Dara are there to help with. And then also Steve has his hand up. So Steve, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, it was just I agree with what Trevor was saying, that we can't have elections. If we did, then shit. What was I saying? You distracted me, Sonia.
You said that you said that you had a solution, and I assume that was to proposals being underspecified, or
no, it was to do with the council vote. What was the last thing that Trump said? Trump, can you repeat your problem, please? Aaron.
Was it about voting?
Yeah, he came up with the problem to. Sorry, it's like it's 20 past midnight here. Yeah. No, I get that, Ben. But Aaron made a specific point that.
Why don't you see if you can remember it, and then we'll return to it.
I'll come back. All right.
Okay. So we're going to now jump back to talking about this remaining specific proposals, and then if we have time left at the end, we can have a more general discussion. And so actually the next one is one of Steve's, which is a genuine protocol opt-in donation feature, which is related to some of the discussion of Steve's earlier proposal. So Steve, do you want to talk about this a little bit, and then we can discuss it?
Yeah, sure. I just remember what I wanted to talk about before, joining proposals. Remind me about that later on, and we'll talk about that afterwards. That was towards what Aaron was saying. Again, it goes hand in hand with my other proposal. Why are the miners getting taxed? As it's already been stated, the mining hardware developers don't care. So who are they selling the equipment to? And they will stop making the equipment if they can't sell it. So if it comes to a point where the price drops so low, it might still be enough to fund the ECC, but it might not be enough to fund the miners. Then you end up. I know the difficulty algorithm should sort this out, but you will end up with a situation where you end up with no hardware and no one mining your coin because no one wants to pay the tax. So this is more to do with distributing it and to try and keep the longevity, because if you're going to enforce them and do some sort of mandatory fee, then it should be on transactions, because transactions are infinite wealth for development, and in 500 years the crypto space is going to be very different to what it is now, and the only way to make sure you can keep up with that, if you want to keep going with this corporate style development structure, is to make sure you've got an indefinite source of wealth, and that is transaction fees. And that is also tied into metrics, because to get transaction fees, people have to be transacting and using your currency. So it seems to sort of fall out. I know it goes against the idea of keeping transaction fees as low as possible, but there's already a secondary market. So I don't see the problem with taxing transaction fees rather than mining fees.
So what are people's thoughts on that? All right, Matt, go ahead.
If we want people to use the currency more, we shouldn't make it cost more to use the currency. If we think that Zcash is going to be a store of value, I think a higher transaction fee is a great idea. If we instead think that we should subsidize the security with inflation, which is the current plan, then we should do exactly what we're doing. And I think that it's pretty clear that miners are not engaged in this discussion. And so I think that, I think the idea that they're like missing out right now, or with any taxes, quote unquote, on their earnings is when I'm taxed, I usually complain about it or to whoever can hear, and so I don't think they probably feel taxed.
I strongly disagree with that, mate. I really do. The ECC has even admitted the amount of goodwill that was lost over the ASIC for ASIC, however you pronounce it, yeah. It was pretty outstanding. It went from a very vibrant, lively, engaging community. You can go back and look at the forums and look. I've dragged up posts from months, from years ago, that show people getting involved, building stuff on top of Zcash. It's where the forums came from in the first place. Was the community made them? All that seems to have sort of been gone. And that left when GPU mining left and miners left, and the miners you have now don't care as long as they're making profit. And if you're going to take less profit and less margins away from them, why are they going to buy the ASICs?
I see what you're saying. So you're really complaining about ASIC resistance rather than taxes in particular. Is that correct?
No, I'm saying a bit of both. ASIC resistance has become a vulnerability now because of the dev fee taxes thing. You had a lot more options with GPUs, or the community was more vibrant. People were having problems, people were getting involved, and I know it was new back then, but it was a lot more involved. It was a lot less corporate, as it were. And I think we're in the Zcash technology is in danger from the Zec asset getting smashed because people don't make the technology to mine it. And the people that do mine it, like you're saying, there are no people who from China here who are representing the field. They've reached out to the pools. The pools aren't interested. As long as they're selling profit, they don't care. As soon as it stops, it's very mercenary for them. Whereas it doesn't have to be. So if you move your source of revenue from the mercenary people to the people using the system, and then you increase adoption of the system. I'm not saying up transaction fees. I'm just saying take your money from transaction fees rather than taking it from block distribution. Take it from the block reward rather than the distribution, because the reward goes on forever and the distribution stops. That's the point of the zip.
Matt and Antoinette, it seems like you both have further thoughts on this. Matt, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. There's just a lot of stuff here that I'd like to see a little bit of proof of. This is also how I feel about, in the earlier stage of the internet. Like we always want the good old days, and I want to go back and be on my little Unix box, and I guess I would really like to see some evidence that that it's possible to get the good days back. And I also think that this idea of like transaction fee versus miner reward, it seems almost orthogonal. Or I mean, it's related, but it's like not that tightly related. So I think we have two things: ASIC resistance and transaction fees. But yeah, that was my point.
Does anybody else want to chime in here? Otherwise, we can move on to. This is me giving a chiming in moment.
Just to quickly respond to Jack in chat, the transaction fees, it was on top of the current base transaction fees. So yes, you are taking something from miners, but no, it was more to take the money from people transacting. So like currently how wallet developers do it, they say if you're going to use my wallet, you're going to, every time you use it, you give this little bit of ZEC to me. Like how mining software works. Every time I use it, I have to donate some of my hash power to whoever. So it was from that point of view. So it's from the users of the network rather than miners of the network. Was the point behind this?
All right. So next, we're going to talk about Rebecca Mercer's proposal related to carbon offsetting, which I think I can sum up as saying, basically, we should do some kind of carbon offsetting. I don't think it's a great deal more specific than that. What do people think?
Let's see. Well, carbon offsetting.
Dara, real quick, can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, yes. I'm Dara. I do protocol design work and specification for ECC.
That is the biggest undersell I've ever heard, but okay. you do at least do those things.
I'm a cryptographer.
All right. Dara, why don't you now go ahead and say your piece.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit skeptical in general that carbon offsetting it is an effective way to reduce carbon emissions, but I mean, I would prefer to just move to proof of stake. But if we're not going to do that, or if we're going to do something else in the shorter term, then carbon offsetting is better than nothing.
Does it make sense to do that through the protocol?
Well, I haven't read the draft. Can you just summarize what this draft is, basically? Other than just saying that would be nice.
I think that is actually about as far as it goes.
Okay.
There are a few more details, mostly about motivation. So the specification section, I'll just read it so that we're all on the same page. The community comes to consensus on one or several entities who is trusted with carbon offsetting. And then either we partner with this entity or these entities and directly transfer a portion of newly minted coins to their Zcash address with each newly mined block, or a semi-trusted third party receives the newly minted coins to their address and then somehow publishes that they transferred them off-chain to the entities involved in carbon offsetting.
Okay, so I understand the basic idea. I think we need to know what the actual current carbon price is, and what proportion of the dev fund or the money available from block rewards is, because depending on what proportion it is, either it's going to have a negligible effect on carbon offsetting, or it's going to be too much. So I don't know.
All right, Iran, what's your thought?
I suggest to decide that our contribution to mitigating climate change is enabling people to purchase books and scientific articles on climate change in the United States of America without being persecuted.
All right. Unless anyone has further thoughts here, we're going to hit the last proposal, and then I think we'll do a 5-minute break, and whoever wants to can regroup for ending discussion. So changing the Zcash supply curve to 3% yearly after 2020 halving. It is pretty much what it sounds like. A different summary sentence is change Zcash issuance to consistent 3% yearly inflation, no more halvings, until the remainder of the 21 million ZEC supply is exhausted. I know that people have various different concerns about this, and maybe people also have thoughts in favor of it that they'd want to share. So does anyone want to chime in here? Or, oh, okay. So Andrew just queued in chat, and then Dara. Oh, Dara, you missed this earlier. I'm asking people to queue up in chat
Yes,
when they want to say something.
Well, I will queue up.
All right. So Andrew and then Dara.
Yeah, so hopefully this is okay. I guess this really makes me want to discuss a sort of meta question. We can throw it in there with things like metrics, but people often mention the idea of precedent setting and that there's already an implicit bias. Like if we accept a proposal that's 20%, then that establishes a precedent that somehow accepting that proposal means committing to 20% forever. And that, just by doing something symbolically different now, like 10% rather than 20%, sets a hard to change precedent that it'll keep going down, bit by bit, by half every time. So just accelerating even slower than or even faster than the halving rate for emission itself. And I don't know how to think about that because, you could make a decision that doesn't have precedent, like precedence is for courts. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. And these things do set social precedents that are very hard to claw back. So I'd love to hear more about, especially from Chris or anyone who has thoughts on the meaning of precedent there. My initial thought is that the default should be that whatever we do is sunsets in 4 years. With, I guess my instinct is that the default would be that it goes back to no dev fund in 4 years, unless we affirmatively decide again to do something better in 4 years. But I can understand people wanting to do it again earlier. I could understand people not wanting not to change these settings once we've set them now. So yeah, those are the questions that I would like to ask that I think are relevant to this proposal.
All right, Dara, you're up, and then Matt.
So first of all, I would like to clarify that throughout this call, and including my answers to the last question, I'm speaking for myself and not for ECC, and not as a zip editor. Okay. So if we had an issuance of 3%, then that would obviously preclude any issuance-based dev funding because there just isn't enough inflation to fund development of the protocol in that case. I also think it would be very controversial to change the issuance schedule at all. I'm implacably opposed to changing it, to making any changes to the issuance schedule. I think there was an implicit contract with everyone who uses Zcash, in fact, that the issuance schedule would not change significantly as a function of time.
All right, Matt, what's your contribution?
Yeah, I guess I also agree that we shouldn't be making big changes to the supply schedule, but to go a little step further, I think that a default of hung jury, no decision, everything reverts back to whatever's in the code is good. And so I think that I like to think in 4 years, if Zcash is wildly successful, then there's either thousands and thousands of people are going to have to somehow come together to make a decision, or there will be no decision and it'll fall back to what's in the code. So yeah, I guess I think the whole precedent idea is silly unless we code it in so that it works for the next halving. Precedent's not going to do anything.
All right, so at this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break for those of us who have been on this call for, 2.5 hours at this point. So we'll come back at 35 after, and feel free, if people don't have to leave, feel free to continue discussing here or just chatting, and then we'll reconvene formal discussion at, okay, let's make it 36 after. So I'll see you all momentarily.
My sympathies to everyone who's been here for 2 hours.
Hopefully we can talk about Burn a bit after this.
Okay.
Oh, hi there. It's really nice to speak to you.
Hey, thank you. You too.
Just in case, note everyone, we're still being recorded. Did you catch the question earlier about what to do with ill-defined zips?
I did not. Yeah, I only joined when I started speaking.
Oh yes, I asked someone to remind me about this actually, but I'll let someone else speak first.
So I just say the question. Maybe the answer is better given than with the full quorum.
Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, well, the observation is that many of the current proposals have crucial ill-defined components, like an election or some parties come in. Now, what happens if we vote on and such a proposal wins? Then what?
That's a good question. So the vote is being organized by the foundation. So that is this a question for the foundation or a question about the zip process? Because the zip process, as long as a draft zip, you see, a draft zip doesn't have to be complete in order to be merged. So if we decide to adopt one of those zips, then we're basically committing to dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's at some point before before the decision about whether it goes into the protocol. So any vote on adopting a zip that isn't specified yet cannot be a final vote that it goes into the protocol, by definition.
So, I don't know that anyone's asked specifically. Oh, sorry to jump in there, but we are in chaos mode, so I don't mind that much.
Right.
Okay. I don't think anyone's asked the zip editors specifically, but like, what are your feelings on us reusing essentially the zip process for these kind of political or rather, strategic decision making? Like deliberating, is it set up for that? Like, I think that what we know how to do is do polling on zips, but not like to use Helios to, moderate a discussion or drive it towards clear specifications.
So the zip process is a technical specification editing process. It is not a decide what to do process.
Is it a layout proposals to decide what to do by accepting the zips process?
So the zip editors do not decide to accept zips into the protocol. They decide whether to merge them, but that is not a decision on whether they should go into the protocol. That's not part of the zip editor's role.
There's no rules dictating whether you can jump in or not right now, Steve.
Okay, I'd just like to say on the forums, we did have a bit of a chat about this, and I did want ask Aaron to remind me about this. The idea behind it is just going to be, I think this is where the voting process, even though I'm part of the governance panel, I think this is where the whole idea of voting in this scenario is flawed. We cannot really get one proposal that's going to do anything. I know Matt said in chat that we need more specification, but realistically, none of us are in a position to be able to do that. So I think really what's going to happen, or what would be best, is if of all of the proposals that come together, there is a meeting between the foundation and the ECC, a live stream, or whatever, and then they hash out between them what they think is best, and then they put that back to the community for us to decide on. I think that's realistically the only way we can proceed, and we have to bow to the Foundation's experience in this area, and the ECC have the numbers and they have the knowledge. So we we have to rely on them. We've relied on them this far. I think it's essential to this part of the process now. I don't think voting in any form, especially with the knockout round process that we're talking about, would serve any benefit here. We'll just end up with Brexit, but for Zcash. I think the English people will be able to empathise with that, whatever you're
Yeah, we definitely
I
don't
appreciate
want
the
that.
point.
Please don't let that happen.
Okay, so hello everyone. We're back. And so at this point, we have gone over all of the proposals, and I think maybe we could do the thing where we go around and say how we're feeling about either this process or a specific proposal. This is a somewhat open discussion time, but I am going to ask people to keep queuing, and we can sort of let the discussion go where it leads. So who has a thought they want to share at this point? Oh, okay, Eran, there you go. Hi,
So
Linda.
I'd like to have more discussion of the process ahead of us and how do we get from the current first shots and many of which have evolved into discussions exploring variants and have missing specifications and some glaring issues that need to be addressed. How does this converge into something that is well specified and can be technically executed?
So the first part of sorry, if I can jump in there.
Yeah,
The
I
first
think
part.
if no one is queued, feel free to jump in at will as a general principle. So go ahead, Dara.
So there is some work to do just editorially that I have not been able to do because I've been on vacation for 3 weeks. So that can be sorted out pretty quickly now. But that's not going to resolve political issues like if for the zips that involve creating some new party that has an authority. That's the zip editors. It's not our role to define things like that.
So one thing that I've been wondering about, Dara, just thinking about like some incremental steps we could make to make this process better, especially to the extent that it basically like expropriates resources from the zip technical, editing staff and their time. Should we be making these specs more modular? Like my instinct has been that we should be having like sentiment polls about different aspects, like increase this, agree to this principle. But if we just do like voting on zips, then that's somewhat more coarse-grained. It assumes they've already been settled by the time they're zips.
I think that would be helpful, yes.
Cool.
We were originally planning to do that, and we got some private pushback feedback. But if I think if that's something that the community really wants, I guess the foundation is open to input there. This might be something worth making into a forum thread. Matt, why don't you go ahead?
I guess I was just thinking it's a lot to ask the community to read all these proposals, but also I'm a little afraid of a pick and choose menu because then we're not, whatever the answer is, it's not going to be balanced. So I wonder if there's maybe there's a way to cut down the proposals to something a little bit easier to swallow before we talk about some sort of pick and choose polling.
Weren't we meant to do that between the last stream and this stream?
I don't think we have kind of a general outlines sort of process, but some of these specifics are things that we really are all kind of figuring out on the fly. So there is room here for people to step in and I don't know if there's a particular kind of discussion you want to have or a particular way that you want to see the proposals broken down, either like writing it out in detail or advocating for it with proposal champions would be a good way to get started there. Steve wanted to talk about burn. I don't have any thoughts, so someone who does should say them.
Well, why would we ever
If
want to
I'm-
burn coins? What's the motivation?
Steve, I think you were about to say something?
I was, yeah. Well, why ever burn coins? The idea is to get the coins in as many people's hands as possible. Why burn them? A lot of proposals are relying on it. We need to figure out a different mechanism. If there is going to be some sort of fiscal punishment for not performing or whatever, to whatever metrics that are decided upon. I still don't see how all that works, but yeah, then we can't just throw the coins away, and I don't see how paying back past miners helps at all. The only two realistic scenarios are you either extend the total emission curve, the total emission length, so rather than your final halving happening whenever it carries on past that point, or you extend the current halving. It's which one is more important. If it's been decided upon that it's big enough just to arbitrarily decide to keep taking 20% of the mining reward when that wasn't going to happen, then I don't see why the curve is so much of a sacred cow that you couldn't extend a halving, or the total emission curve, at the benefit of keeping coins in circulation.
Iran, what are your thoughts since you just raised your hand?
I think these are great questions, and there's now a couple of dedicated threads, one that Steve created and one that Zuko created a few days ago. But I would like to take this opportunity to use this as a case study for the procedural question. So suppose that Steve or I or anyone likes one of the current proposals, except that the proposal burns and Steve thinks it should instead extend the emission curve, and I think that it should instead pay future miners, whatever. So, and suppose also that the original proposal's author is happy with the burning. So how does this play out? Do we need to create our own zips? Is it even allowed at this stage? Or is there some later process where we can say, well, that proposal was chosen, but let's tweak it at a later stage? How does it work?
We have to be able to tweak proposals. I totally agree with what.
Would just be a cluster of potential proposals that we can then dive into and renegotiate?
I totally agree with what Sonia just said in the chat, that the timeline is the original timeline is completely blown, and we need to reestablish what the deadlines actually are. I think that I think there's no problem with making this public. There's going to be a discussion between ECC and the foundation about NU3 and NU4 deadlines. And so I would think that based on the current situation, NU4 will activate later than it was originally planned, which means it's later than the time at which the original founders reward ends.
Jack, you can go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that you know, the voting process is intended to gauge the community's response to various proposals. But I'm not speaking on behalf of ECC here at all. It strikes me that when the results of that feedback come back, what might be a good idea is for the the company and the foundation to sit down and look at those results and think, right, is there a clear match between what's come back and one of the proposals, or should we basically create a new proposal, that reflects the community's wishes? And I've not been involved in, again, in any discussions about this, and I don't represent the company, but this also kind of also is aligned with what I was saying previously about, at the moment, effectively, Zcash is stewarded by both the company and the foundation. So I think that tying ourselves or restricting ourselves to only selecting one of the pre-existing proposals is not necessarily a great idea.
Matt, do you still want to talk?
Oh yeah, I just had a question for Dara, which was, I do think there's a reason to burn, but I'm very, very interested as a proposal author in an alternative. I just don't want to blow up the complexity of implementation on Zcash, and that's if I want to do something in my proposal that restricts payout to a particular dev fee recipient based on the USD value. Seems like my options are: one, bring the USD value onto chain, which is like, obviously that's ridiculously complicated and not something we'd want to do. Or two, have some sort of way to return excess Zeke or do something with excess Zeke. So literally what I'm looking for in this tech is a way to say, look, I'm holding some Zcash. I want it to go to everyone else. I'm okay if everyone else is actually all coin holders, like a burn would, or if everyone else, quote unquote, is actually not everyone else. It's just the miners who would have gotten this if there were not a dev fee. And it's just the complexity of implementing that last option has been my only concern here. I think you're muted.
Yes, thank you. I wouldn't actually worry about the complexity of implementing that too much. It's not significantly worse than burning. So the protocol
sweet.
complexity is about the same, really.
Well, you just fixed my proposal. Thank you. I'm going to fix that and then probably say details Dara.
Okay, yeah. Strad and I can work that out. Sorry, I'm volunteering, Strad, here.
Get into that bus.
Yeah, Matt, DC here. I think we appreciate the intent around that process, but I do know from conversations with regulatory counsel here in the U.S. that burn trigger for the DC post DAO report. So there's got to be another way that we describe that mechanism that doesn't use that four-letter word, but still it uses
100%.
So on the regulatory
just FYI, everyone, reminder that this call is being recorded and is going to be
it's
published.
recorded. Let me just say this super quick. Very aware of like the the connotations around burn, and I actually left it in the proposal to get this response from folks publicly because I wanted to hear what the alternative was in this community. So like I think I'm the only proposal that seriously suggests that I'm going to remove it. So I don't know if we need to get into it too much.
All right. So Dara's up next, and sorry, Dara, can I make one meta point real quick, which is that I'm going to shut down the officially moderated part of this video. I can actually I could cut off the recording here if people want to discuss informally, or I can keep the recording going.
Yeah.
While you're on meta points, can I just get a shot of my T-shirt in for the recording record that goes along with the recording chat?
Love it.
So
Nice.
I don't think the question I'm going to ask raises any legal issues, but it is basically asking what the regulations are. So is the, if I understood correctly, the issue is that if some party is making decisions that affect issuance, then that's the source of the problem. Not necessarily whether the funds are burnt or not, but just the fact that some party is deciding where they go. Is that correct?
It's a pretty complicated question, frankly, and it's expensive to answer with any clarity.
Okay.
I've just posted a link to the SEC framework into the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I'll read that.
Worth having a read to look at all the different.
I guess I'm just going to make the point. If you approach the legal question with any sort of engineering or logical mindset, it will not give you the right answer, because apparently that's not how the law works. I've learned that over the past 3 years. So
yeah, I should just read that and yeah, discard that question. But thank you, Jack.
Well, if people are feeling done, we can close things down now. Does anyone have any burning points that... Okay, I'm going to take that as no burning points, and I'm going to stop the recording. Well, actually, thank you all so much for participating. I really appreciate your time, and the whole Zcash community benefits from your attention and your thought. So we all thank you. And we'll talk more soon. You can find ECC and the foundation on Twitter. I think lots of the people in this discussion are on the forum, and that's probably where a lot of future discussion of next steps will take place. So keep an eye out. And sorry.
Hang on a sec. Miss FPGA said wait a tick. And what did we decide?
Oh, we didn't decide anything.
This was a hangout. We hung
that
out.
That was my impression too.
Yeah, I don't think this was really intended as a decision-making venue, but more as a way for us to collectively better understand the proposals and for proposal authors to get feedback. So hopefully we'll have some movement in movement soon now that the trademark agreement is signed. Hooray! And I'm gonna go back to saying goodbye. So
thank you for the amazing moderation.
Thank you.
Amazing moderation.
Thank you, Sonia.
Given the
Thanks,
number.
Sonia.
Bye, everybody.